As a recovering book snob, I can tell you with great confidence that literary fiction readers are not better readers than any other group of readers. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to a video that I have really been planning to talk about for some time, but my kind of reading this month, where I'm kind of concentrating on reading science fiction and fantasy for the first time really in a long time, has made me more aware of kind of, how different genres are treated and how oftentimes literary fiction is held up as being like the highest form of the written art. So I wanted to talk about literary fiction, kind of what it is, what the term means, what I think makes something a work of literary fiction, maybe give you some examples of literary fiction if you want to, and kind of also then talk about a new term I just learned, which is upmarket fiction. Which is not a topic I know about. So to begin with, I hate the term literary fiction. If it were up to me, I would just have all works of fiction classified as fiction that were not clearly genre fiction. So if you think about this in terms of Barnes & Noble, Barnes & Noble actually does a pretty good job of this. They have a section that's just called fiction, and in that section you can find literary fiction. You can oftentimes find classics in there as well, and they just classify it as fiction. But next to that they have mystery and thriller sections, they have romance sections, etc. And so they seem to kind of have figured out what I think is the ideal way of looking at this. That there really shouldn't be anything that we refer to as literary fiction. We should just call everything that isn't clearly genre fiction fiction. I think that reduces the snobbery, perhaps the pretentiousness of literary fiction as a genre. That we could just call it fiction, general fiction. That would be great. But as I indicated to you a minute ago, I also learned that there's another term out there which is somewhere between, I guess, genre fiction and literary fiction, and that's called upmarket fiction. So the way I heard upmarket fiction described was that it is fiction written by very good writers who create art in their writing but still know how to tell a story. Which indicates that literary fiction oftentimes, something I think is true about literary fiction, and that's oftentimes that it doesn't necessarily focus on story. But this idea of upmarket fiction and my reading in science fiction fantasy this month really kind of made me aware that there just are differences, obviously, in the way in which genres are written, and therefore there are differences, perhaps, or things to know about literary fiction. So to begin with, what makes something a work of literary fiction? So I would say the number one thing that makes something a work of literary fiction is writing with artistic intent. Now, you should know, and I've already mentioned to you that I really don't like this the term literary fiction. You should know I don't think any writer sits down to write bad prose. But what I think writers of literary fiction and upmarket fiction attempt to do is they attempt to make the writing itself a feature. The way in which they construct sentences can even be the way in which they punctuate their sentences, the way in which they use words and language in the sentences. I think they are intentionally have an artistic purpose, not just in telling the story, the creating of characters or following of themes, but with the writing itself. So I think here of Jan Fosse with the Septology, which I read and I really loved. His writing is done in a specific way, I think it's called slow writing, where there's a lot of repetition and a lot of repetition of words and images and ideas, and the writing itself is a feature. I think that's something that is key to a lot of literary fiction, that the authors there are intent on writing in a way that it has artistic value in and of itself. A second thing I think would make something a work of literary fiction is how heavily it relies on or builds subtext. That is, meaning that is not clearly expressed in the book. Literary fiction is going to lean heavily on subtext, so that you're going to get to the end of the book and you may even wonder what happened, what was that about, or and you may, while you're reading, have ideas where you think, I wonder if this is what is meant. I wonder if this is what is really happening behind the scenes or underneath, or what the emotions of these people really are, or these characters really are. I think that's a big feature of literary fiction. Also, I think that oftentimes in literary fiction, the idea, the nugget of the idea around which the novel is written, whether it's grief or love or violence or any of those things, the idea around which the novel is constructed is incredibly important. And it's an idea, that's kind of amorphous. It's not necessarily a clearly defined thing. Like, the idea behind a mystery novel is somebody's committed these crimes and we're going to try to figure it out. That's an idea, but we talk about the idea being love or hate or violence or grief or whatever. That idea is really kind of at the forefront, oftentimes, of works of literary fiction. I'd also then say that the formatting of novels can also kind of tip them into this literary fiction group, where there's something different about the way in which the words are arranged on the page, or the pages themselves are formatted, that it may include images, drawings, works of art, snippets of poetry from somewhere else. The words may be written sideways on the page. There may be a lot of white space. These kind of things, in the way in which the novel is formatted, also, I think, have a tendency to be far more common in works of literary fiction. And so, if you notice that one of the things I didn't mention here are plots or characters. So, it's not that literary fiction doesn't have memorable characters. A lot of works of literary fiction do, but they oftentimes de-emphasize perhaps the importance of the character in favor of those other things. And most importantly, plot is not necessarily high on the list of things that the author is going for. They may be telling a story, but the story itself may not be, the central thing, the most important thing about the novel. So that then brings me back to this idea of, upmarket fiction. Upmarket fiction then would be a blend between commercial fiction, fiction that tells a story and seeks to entertain, and at the same time these kind of artistic features existing in works of fiction. So, when I thought about upmarket writers, I think about, because my current reading obsession is Percival Everett, I would describe him as somebody who fits in that upmarket group more often. There's a lot going on in a Percival Everett novel, but the man can still tell a story. And characters are still oftentimes important, even though it's not necessarily true in all of Percival Everett's works. And again, if I were going to emphasize, a writer who I think is more pure literary fiction, I would go with Jan Fosse, because I think the way in which his novels are written and the emotion he intends to evoke are more important than the story that he's actually telling. Now, having said all that, in the past, when we read, works that we now consider to be, I'm just going to go with American classics, oftentimes did all of those things, and yet we didn't have those classifications for them. If you were to read Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Faulkner, you would find three writers with very distinct writing techniques, with very distinct ideas about writing, who wrote books in very different ways from one another. In the case of Faulkner, sometimes different ways from himself. And that the writing itself was a part of what they were doing. Modernists, which all three of those men were kind of self-conscious about writing in a new way, and all three of those men did. Fitzgerald writing the most traditional way of the three, but we didn't call that literary fiction. They didn't market it as literary fiction in the 30s, 40s, 50s. I don't know exactly when the term came into use, but it didn't used to be marketed that way. It just used to be marketed as fiction. And somewhere along the line, we split these two things. And my understanding is literary fiction is a marketing label to help readers identify what they want to read by slapping that label on it. And I can't help but think that's a shame. Additionally, you can find works of science fiction, works of romance, works of fantasy, mystery, thriller, horror, that cross those lines, that are themselves, works of literary fiction. So to me, it would be better if we just got rid of the entire term, which always feels snobbish to me. And even today, as a recovering literary snob, I feel uncomfortable using the term literary fiction to describe what I like to read, but it does communicate things. And I sincerely wish we could just go back to talking about things as fiction. Anyway, there you go. If you have thoughts, comments on this, I look forward to them in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.